and just what to look for to avoid contamination and make sure that the food that you're producing on your farm gets to market safely. I also did want to throw in a little bit about COVID-19 coronavirus just as an extra thing to think about in these times. So, why we think about food safety is because of just unfortunately how common foodborne illness is. It's estimated 1 in 6 people is going to have this every year, and that's 48 million people. Unfortunately, we think vomiting, diarrhea, you don't feel good, but it can be pretty serious and it can have long term effects and even result in death. And this is something that is preventable. So I'm going to start with an example, just the April 2018 romaine lettuce outbreaks that folks probably heard about in the news. There were over 200 cases of people sickened by romaine lettuce, and that's when people actually confirmed that they ate the thing. This affected about 36 states, and almost 100 people were so sick they ended up in the hospital. E. coli illness can be quite severe, and unfortunately, 5 people even died. And then it happened again later that year in a different region. They did end up having a recall of product where people are told if you bought romaine, throw it in the garbage. And they didn't have any further deaths, but there were still almost another 70 cases. It's unfortunately not just romaine. I had to pick on lettuce a bit because those are two examples that were in the news recently. But if you remember a few years back, cantaloupes, there was a big outbreak. Also, eggs, mushrooms, tomatoes, even some other leafy greens, spinach, and cilantro have had recalls or outbreaks associated with them. And even apples, caramel candy apples, not regular apples, had a contamination issue a few years back. It's also not just E. coli, that's one of the more common ones that people know by name, but it could be listeria, hepatitis, salmonella, or even cyclospora, which most people haven't heard about. And again, it's a range of things, but food safety is really the common thread that we're talking about. So if we think about not just worker safety, but consumer safety, there are some folks who are going to be a lot more vulnerable to illness. And one of the groups would be small children. If you look at the statistics about salmonella, especially, they're 3 times as likely to get so sick they need to go to the hospital. That's pretty severe. Older adults are also more vulnerable. If they get some sort of foodborne illness, they're likely to get very, very ill just because their immune system can't handle it as well. And then another group is anybody who already has a weak immune system, people who have cancer treatments or kidney disease or some other factor are going to become very severely ill if they have foodborne illness. And then if you're pregnant, you're 10 times as likely to get sick with listeriosis, which is a little bit scary. So that's where some of the rules about deli meats and other foods during pregnancy come about. So with Food Safety Modernization Act or FSMA, the real goal of this is to, instead of just responding when something happens, when there's an outbreak, they want to shift the focus to, well, let's take a step back and think about how we can prevent it in the first place. So that's really where all of these food safety shifts are coming in. And as ag is the first step in our food production chain, things that happen on the farm, out in the field, during harvest, and then even in the packing house, if you're doing some processing, can affect worker health. Your workers could get sick, or one person gets sick and gets everyone else sick. Can also affect just the safety of the things that are produced on the farm, what you're growing and what you're selling to feed people. And consumer safety is a real concern. I actually was in the store in March, and the whole produce section, it was when everybody was going to the store and toilet paper panic and all of those things. The whole produce section in my small rural grocery store was cleaned out except romaine lettuce. So that was one product that I think some people are still a little concerned with. And unfortunately, fruits and vegetables are healthy, but if people are afraid to eat them, that can linger after there's been a recall. So if you think about how many things you do during a day of working on the farm, how many pieces of fruit or how many vegetables you can harvest per hour. I usually ask orchard workers, well, okay, how many bins do you fill a day? How many apples per bin? If you think about it, anything on your hands is going to spread everywhere very easily without you even thinking about it. You're touching plants, you're touching your picking bag or your boxes, bins. If you work with tools or ladders, germs can spread so easily and we can't see them. So that's a big problem. Workers themselves can get sick. Just we know now, face touching is really bad. Things can get in your eyes, nose, and mouth if you're wiping sweat off your brow, if you're wearing a cloth face covering and touching it. If you're eating with dirty hands, if you didn't wash your hands well enough, sometimes people don't take the full 20 seconds. You can have germs go in that way, or just eating produce that hasn't been washed first. Those are all ways that people can become ill. And then when we look at consumers, as soon as things leave the farm, there's all those other steps in getting food from the farm to the people. That could be the grocery store, it could be how they're preparing things at home. But again, foodborne illness is very common. It can be mild, it can be someone doesn't feel well, cramps, vomiting, diarrhea. Those are usually the things we think of, but it can also be flu like illness where the person just doesn't feel well and they might not even recognize it as foodborne illness. There's concern where it can be confused for pesticide related exposure or even just heat stress. You feel kind of sick to your stomach, like you're going to throw up, you feel a little bit dizzy or lightheaded. That could be from foodborne illness or it could be just from being out in the heat. So thinking about all of those food safety things, again, FSMA is focusing on prevention rather than responding to outbreaks. So there are a lot of rules, and if you've been through the farmer training, it's pretty extensive, but there's some things to just go over with your workers. And again, that should be done every single year, at least once a year, going through the third party audits, going through all of the safety information. It's a lot. But it's pretty simple if you think about it. Having clean hands when you're touching other people's food, if you're doing any harvest activities, if you're out in the fields, start your day with soap and water, wash for at least 20 seconds, and also focusing between the fingers, back and palms of the hands, around and under your fingernails where things can hide out. Most people, unfortunately, are not doing as good a job as they should with hand washing, and it really does need to be the full 20 seconds. If any of you have seen the glow germ where you shine a light over somebody's hands, pretty easy. You can also do a demonstration with your workers if you put on a pair of gloves and rub paint on them, and then just show if you wash your hands, it doesn't all come off. So hand washing really is key before work and as they're leaving work to go home, but also anytime they're taking a break. Before and after using the restroom, if they had any pesticide residues on their hands, the groin area can absorb things pretty quickly. Anytime anyone's chewing gum, eating something, drinking, if you're going to touch your face, do so with clean hands. And then before you go back to work, after you've had your lunch break, you'll want to wash your hands again. So, hand washing for workers really, really is key. We can see dirt pretty easily if you've been working in a muddy field, you've been gardening, you can tell when your hands are dirty. And hand sanitizer does not work. If there's any visible dirt on your hands, it's really not going to do as good a job. The problem is with hand washing, we can get the dirt off, we know that, but the germs are not so easy to spot. So it really does need to be about contact time. You can rinse off the dirt in just a second or two in some cases, and it does take the full 20 seconds for the soap and water to do its job. Toilets and wash stations are also really key with food safety. Having access to water, soap, and towels during the day so they can wash their hands, and also discouraging behavior like going to the edge of the field, human waste, animal waste, bird droppings, those can all contaminate produce. So having the wash stations and toilet facilities are really important. And making sure workers are putting the toilet paper in the toilet and then anything else in the garbage can. Just if there's a lot of people working, it keeps everything clean and orderly for everyone. Also, encourage them if anything's running out. You might not be right in that area to see it. Before there's no soap and there's been no soap for a day, make sure people are ready to tell their supervisor about it. So making sure there's water, soap, towels, everything's kept in good shape, and that folks are trying to keep it clean for everyone else. How we get into the other rules that should be pretty easy. People should already be doing this. Cover your coughs and sneeze in your elbow just so you're not spreading things around, all of those respiratory droplets, all of the things that can fly around and settle on produce, and also how easily, if workers are near each other, those things can make other people ill. Even if it's just allergies, covering cough and sneezes, no one wants droplets on them. Ways to avoid contaminating produce. Having rules about what's allowed in production areas is very important. People should not be eating while they're harvesting. That can be a risk for the worker as well as contaminating produce. And then even things like bringing in glass bottles or any beverages other than water can be a risk for contaminating. Other things, just people using phones or electronics or anything in your pockets that could fall out if you're putting things in bins. In apple packing or onion packing facilities, you don't want to have anything that could get entangled with machinery, any jewelry, anything like a stone in a ring that could fall into the produce. And just in general, any sign of rodent or wildlife activity, anything that you see in harvest areas, tell your workers, I want to know about it. We're going to mark it off. We're not going to do anything with that produce. They should recognize the signs of any rodent nibbles or any bird droppings or anything else like that from wildlife, because that can be a huge threat to food safety. Other contamination, bloodborne pathogens. People might be working with sharp tools. They could slip and cut themselves. Hopefully, they're using those things safely and keeping them clean and sharp so they're less likely to cut themselves. But if there's any blood on the produce, that has to be thrown away, disposed of, can't be processed, can't be packed. And then make sure the supervisor is inspecting all the tools and equipment too, anything that needs to be sanitized before it can be used again. And then for workers with open wounds, especially on the hands, those need to be cleaned up, washed with soap and water, cover them with a bandage, first aid cream, and then have them wear gloves. In certain packing facilities, even the blue bandages that you can see with a blue or a light, they can be detected with a metal detector. So they're like a bright color, you can see them if something falls off in the packing house, but also as things are going through a metal detector, they can find if there's a bandage. So keeps the worker from having an infected wound on their hand, and it also protects the produce from being contaminated with blood. Any workers with signs of foodborne illness, and again, it could be vomiting, diarrhea, just feeling kind of sick. It could be like heat illness or pesticide exposure. Could also just be general flu-like symptoms. Those should be reported to the supervisor right away. They should not be handling produce if they're not feeling well because there's such a risk of spreading it to other workers or to the consumer. And they shouldn't come back to work until they're feeling better. Making sure that folks don't have symptoms while they're handling produce can really prevent some food safety issues. Also, training workers on harvest containers and equipment. So, things like only touching the sides of ladders instead of touching the rungs, making sure that they're looking at picking bags or baskets or boxes, making sure tools are clean. Any storage of anything other than produce in those containers is a no-no. Make sure that they're ready to go. There's no sign of wildlife or rodents. There's no garbage or anything else coming into contact with those containers. And then another thing with avoiding contamination is biosecurity. Who are you allowing in production areas? Who gets to come in the packing house? Do you have a sign-in sheet? Do you make sure everyone's following your food safety rules? And are workers trained to speak up if they see something? You don't have to confront people if you see someone in an area where they shouldn't be, but they should feel comfortable reporting it to the supervisor right away. Hey, someone's here. Are they here because they should be? Are they in a spot where they shouldn't? Is there any sign of a spill or a leak or any sort of products in areas where produce is stored? Any chemical spills could be an issue, but also just any sign of tampering. Unfortunately, now biosecurity also includes thinking about terrorism and threats to the food supply. So that's another thing workers should be aware of. Again, they don't need to confront the person if they see something out of the ordinary. They should just know to tell a supervisor. In some production, protective equipment like hairnets, aprons, and gloves might be required. Just make sure all workers that need those things know how to wear it correctly and know that they need to put it on before they're entering production areas. For safety reasons, people should not be wearing jewelry or anything that could get entangled. Also, having long hair tied back or put under a hat or a hairnet can be important. So again, protective equipment, it's going to depend on what type of job they're doing. If people are wearing disposable gloves, just thinking about, again, what surfaces are they touching? If they're wearing like a rubber glove that's to be cleaned and washed with soap and water between use, they need to make sure that those gloves are staying clean. Safety and health when you leave work. Think about what you could be bringing home with you. Workers who live together could be spreading things around their housing, but also if workers are going home to their family, people who don't work on the farm, they should consider, are there any pesticide residues? Is there something on my hands that I could, if I don't wash up right away, be making someone I live with get sick? So before you go home and hug your kids, good idea to leave your boots by the door. Make sure all work clothing gets stored separately from other laundry. And whoever is doing the laundry should know, wash your hands really well with soap and water. There could be pesticide residues on this clothing. And then anyone working in agriculture, at the end of the day, the first thing you want to do, hit the shower, wash up really well, and then you can enjoy your evening. So I did want to talk a little bit about COVID-19 because things are changing. There's a lot of information out there about consumers being concerned that the food supply is affected by this. Am I going to get sick? People lysoling their groceries, all sorts of things. There is very little, if any, risk of people becoming ill from the food itself or food packaging or fresh produce. People could maybe take the outer leaf off a head of cabbage if they really feel safe for doing that. They should not be using any harsh disinfectants on their produce. But again, food safety is a concern, and we want to make sure consumers feel comfortable eating fruits and vegetables. So just to recap, if you haven't heard this 100 times, this is a very contagious thing we're talking about, and it's mainly spread through respiratory droplets. People cough, people sneezing. Also, I just read a study about people who were singing. There was a chorus practice where people were singing for 2 hours and they became ill. Contaminated surfaces are a secondary way people are getting sick, but primarily it's the respiratory droplets. So if you touch the computer that everyone else has been using, your cell phone that you've been using all day, and you don't wash your hands, those are ways that things can get into your eyes, nose, and mouth. So, those symptoms for COVID 19, again, you may have seen this a bunch of times. The most common ones would be a dry cough, high temperature, and trouble breathing. But there's also a number of other symptoms that have been added. So, if someone just has a sore throat, a headache, muscle pain, shaking, and chills, those are also signs of illness. If someone recently has lost their sense of taste or smell, that's also something that could indicate that. Any workers with symptoms should not be working with produce. They should be staying home and self isolating. But there's also the concern that there's a lot of people who don't have symptoms who could be spreading illness to others. And also, if someone was ill, they're feeling better now, there's a process that needs to be in place before they're allowed to return to work. So follow your health department guidelines, follow the New York State guidelines, just making sure that people have had 3 days with no temperature, that they've done all the things that they need to do before they're allowed back in the workplace around other people. The good news about COVID 19, these are things that you're already doing. All of the food safety practices are helpful in this case too. So, clean hands, covering coughs and sneezes, keeping surfaces that are high touch clean and sanitized. Any of the food surfaces are going to be anyway. And then don't let anyone come to work if they're not feeling well. Stay home if you're sick. And then, really, the only two things that are new would be the focus on don't share things. If you have tools like cutting knives that people are using, it's recommended just get colored tape and write people's name, or just avoid people having to share any sort of tools or equipment, or having disinfectant like a bleach solution so people can wipe it down. The other thing is wearing a cloth face covering if people are close enough to each other. Depending on how you're spacing out people in fields, it might be possible to not have to use that. Outdoors with sunlight and airflow is less of a risk than being indoors in something like a packing house or worker housing. But again, food safety is really the key for everything. I want to see if there's any questions, and I also want to tell everyone thank you for working in agriculture. Apparently, Sunday is Thank a Farm Worker Day, so thank you all for the work that you're doing. You're helping provide safe and healthy food for everyone, and that's a pretty important job. So, Michelle, if you want to unmute folks, see if there's any questions. I think I flew through that.
Sure. Anybody have any questions here? No, I mean, the in general, you know, it was very interesting for me to see, you know, learning all about the FSMA class, you know, teaching the FSMA class, everything like that, and all the regulations and the requirements in terms of food safety. It was very interesting how, I mean, naturally, of course, when all the COVID information came out, how it was all very similar, you know.
Mhm.
So farms, you know, maybe something like the, uh, you know, face covering, social distance, you know, those things were newer, but everything as far as, you know, like washing your hands, you
Mhm.
know, that type of thing was all, you know, farms already had that bit going. So it was very
And there's
interesting.
also the overlap between the worker protection standard with any restricted use pesticides that folks are applying. If workers are in those areas, they're trained on hand washing and all of the things when you go home at the end of the day, doing your laundry and cleaning up. So for food safety, that's important, but for pesticide illness, hand washing throughout the day is really important prevention.
Great. Yeah. So the idea for the you know, the yearly training isn't to be so complicated. It's more straight to the point of the information that you need to give to your workers, or you know, whoever's coming to the farm, so that they get the basics and understand, um, you know, the risks, the prevention, how this all works, and why it's important to do this. So this is the training here. So I do appreciate everybody for coming, and like, if you do have any questions, I'll be happy to stick around. I'm sure Anna will for a couple too. Um, and then also, if you need a, you know, some kind of certification that you've attended the training, I'd be happy to give that out. Or Anna, if you have something like that with NICAM.
I can send a template for one, or if folks send me their names, if you do want a certificate, I can email one. Michelle, I can send it to you.
Okay, yep, great. I'll take care of that for you. So you can keep it in your files for your FSMA information. Okay.
And two things with the training. One, a shout out to NICAM. We do, when we're allowed to, go in person to farms and do this training in English or Spanish for workers. And this was a little bit more because I thought it would be more producers than workers in the class. Usually the training can be pretty quick. We can talk about heat illness, ticks, and tractor safety, forklifts, anything else related to safety and health in agriculture. And it's free in New York. The other thing about training, I think the really critical thing is to explain why. If you even just say, look, this is how much I pay to do my food safety audits, this is how much I'm handing over for someone to come in and look at everything, this is why there's a guy with a clipboard watching you harvest. Just explaining what that process looks like and why there are so many rules, I think is really helpful. You can tell people do this, don't do that. But if you give them a little more context, that can really make a difference.
Yes. And I do encourage everybody to check out the NICAM website. Um, they're a great organization. They have tons of different resources and things that they do. I know I work with NICAM a lot throughout the year. I rely on them for resources as well. So check it out. And we appreciate Anna taking the time today. So I'm going to go ahead and stop recording, and we'll hang out. And if anybody has any questions, let me know.
Thank you for a very short and sweet training.